Hi guys, this is Stephen Stewart from Nuix. I'd like to sort of welcome everyone today for our seminar on eDiscovery of Legacy Archives. Just want to welcome everyone and thank you very much for your time and attention today. We had sort of a tremendous number of registrants and interest in this topic, which means it's really near and dear to a lot of people's hearts. So today we've put together an outstanding panel, and I'll be doing sort of a bit of the moderation. We've got Michael Lappin, our Director of Archiving Technology at Nuix. Michael, can you go ahead and say a quick hi?
Hey, everybody.
Thank you, sir. We also have Therese Capero, who's basically a counsel over at Reed Smith. I've actually worked with both of these folks for years, and really Nuix is thrilled to be bringing, I would say, probably some of the foremost experts in both archiving technology as well as litigation involved around archiving. So I've been involved with it for numerous years, sort of dating all the way back to OTG Software in 1998. And through the years, I've both competed with Michael as part of a sales campaign, but I've also sort of worked hand in hand with Therese, dealing with some of the globe's largest litigation related to email archives. Sort of as part of our intro, we were a little bit joking about that the amount that these two know about archives is in some ways frightening. So with that, we'd like to sort of rock into the agenda. Today, I want to cover sort of off an introduction, talk a little bit about what's an archive. I'm going to go through the relevant case law and basically then talk about some of the eDiscovery challenges, as well as sort of how Nuix can assist with some of these. This is one of those topics that when organizations and individuals hear that we actually can help solve these problems, eyes often light up. So again, some of the really basic aspects that Michael's going to run through about the technology, being able to target these source files directly, and really allowing organizations, both corporate, legal, regulatory, to bring sort of all of the technology and capability that you'd expect to sort of eDiscovery best practice, but to leverage those against an archive. We really we plan to basically unravel all that stuff today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Stephen. So in qualifying what we're really talking about today, I want to talk about what is an archive. So a lot of people have different ideas about what an archive is or isn't. What we're talking about today is a disk-based repository that lives behind the customer firewall. It's an on-premise solution that was very, very popular, say about 10 years ago up until maybe 2012, when roughly about 50,000 enterprises on this planet were sold one of these archives. What happens is data is pulled out of a repository, usually a messaging platform like Microsoft Exchange or Lotus Notes, sometimes also SharePoint, also file systems. This data is moved into a repository where it is highly compressed and single instance, and usually there's an application of some kind of an expiration date. So there's a retention schedule that's applied. It's not usually used for doing disaster recovery. In other words, it's not something to help the Exchange or Lotus Notes server recover after a crash. It's not really used for that. It can be used for compliance or regulatory purposes by collecting a journal mailbox, which is all of the data center received by any number of users. So it can have that spin. And from that, of course, comes eDiscovery. So we have now a repository that's centralized that can be searched. So data is usually indexed to some extent when it's pulled out of its native platform. One of the most important things that Stephen was just alluding to a little bit is that the data that goes into these things is held in very, very proprietary formats. They're all different across all the different archives, and there are dozens of them. And that can often cause a bit of challenge, and we're going to definitely get into those challenges in just a little bit. All of these archives over time developed eDiscovery tools. So they developed rudimentary search, tagging, and production platforms that were sold as bolt-ons to these legacy repositories. So some of the things that help sell these archives, and if you have one, you probably know what were the key drivers for consuming this kind of technology. It was really, really hot. I mean, back in 2007, I think I was on the road every week, and I probably demonstrated those kind of products probably a dozen times a week, and I would say half of those actually were sold. It was really easy because of a variety of different things. These are in no particular order. eDiscovery and compliance in 2008, after the civil rules of procedure changed, you started to see an adoption of requiring to be able to do reasonably timely discovery across an archive, which is, of course, a growing repository of, the main product of an enterprise, which is, well, email, right? Information management was a big part of this, where these companies said, well, geez, we're going to have to get our hands around managing retention of these things very quickly. We're going to have to apply retention schedules. The truth is that even though these archives did all this stuff and did motivate buyers, it didn't necessarily get implemented. I tried cleverly to write a white paper about retention trends. I thought that might be of some use to the world. Pulled over 100 different enterprise customers that had an archive, and they all had a variety of different retention sort of ideas. About 40% of them said, yeah, we're going to keep data for X number of years. They kind of had a formula, but exactly 0% of those 100 customers ever implemented the ability to expire anything. So what does that mean? That means, well, you just traded a big amount of data in your archive or your email platform for a huge amount of data, well, in your archive. Mailbox management was great. Let's make sure that Exchange and Lotus Notes run better. We can back them up. They're not slowed down by the sheer bulk of the mailboxes as they grow. Let's contain sort of the quantity of data that is going to be coming in and out of our organization. When you pull the mail out, well, guess what? You can put more mail into the mail platform. So it's going to sit and collect in the archive. And by far the number one thing that made customers pull the trigger was this storage optimization concept. In other words, if we pull data out of the mailboxes, the SharePoint sites, the file servers, the users can continue to use our enterprise environment as it is. We can use cheaper infrastructure, cheaper storage. We can compress the data, single instance it. We can move PST files and we can single instance those. So the idea of consuming seemingly less stuff was very, very appealing. But fast forward, and we're going to talk about what challenges occur when you buy in to this, sort of four-piece benefit statement.
Yeah, so just a quick shot sort of our attendees. I'd like to do a quick poll. So in your current role, are you working with, do you have your own archive? Do you work with other company archives? You've got a little bit of both, as well as you don't have any experience to archive. So we're going to give it probably another couple of seconds, maybe 20 or so. I'm just sort of watching the votes roll in. And really sort of as the numbers are coming in, it's really pretty much a mixed bag, with the leader being that most people have really done a little bit of both. They either have their own company's archives or they've worked with others. But the reality is archives are pretty prevalent within this community, obviously, based on that. So I guess, Nick, let's go ahead and close it, and we'll move on.
Oh, those are some great results. So, in discussing these archives with customers on a daily basis, routinely over the years, the $64,000 question is always, do you have the time and money to remediate these archives, whether it's a compelling event like eDiscovery or a migratory transitory event like we're just done, we're going to migrate off of this archive. No matter what the use case may be, and it may be both, the question is always, do you have the time and the money to use traditional applications and methods to do what you've got to do, which is searching and producing data or moving data for migratory purposes? And I'm finding more and more that the answer is sort of starting to get to be no. We don't have years. We don't have millions of dollars. So I wanted to bring Teresa in to start to comment on proportionality and the state of these archives with regard to eDiscovery today. Teresa?
Thanks, Michael. I mean, just to pick up on what Michael was saying about these archives, what we've seen in the eDiscovery world is that they were, in fact, sold to these companies as a solution. There was a lot of fear, in particular in the legal world, with decisions coming out about sanctions and spoliation and Zubilake and all of that, raised a lot of concern with companies about their ability to keep data, in particular email. And so these were sold as, here's your solution. You can keep all your data. You don't have to worry about it anymore. You've got control over what you delete and what you don't delete. And it sounded really good at the time. But as with most things, once you get into it, you realize that there are problems and there are challenges. And frequently with new technology, thought is given to efficiencies and the burdens of the day-to-day operations, but they don't think about what's down the road. So eDiscovery, regulatory compliance, what do I do with this data? And as the volumes grew, we start to realize that these archives, while really good at keeping stuff, are not so great when you need to get it out, particularly when the volumes get big. And people weren't getting rid of things. So these archives have now become completely unwieldy, and as Michael alluded to, the search and the extraction technologies for the archives are fairly rudimentary, particularly when you see the advances in technology that we've seen over the last several years. So you do come up to a situation where it is an enormous burden to get data out of these archives. And I think when we talk about undue burden and inaccessibility in the legal context, what comes to mind first and foremost in everybody's minds is backup tapes, because that's where inaccessibility started, and that's where people go to. But it's really much more than that. When you start talking about proportionality and what is reasonable and are things inaccessible, legacy archives, particularly depending on the kind of request that is being made, can be inaccessible. And one of the things that I think everybody should keep in mind when we're talking about proportionality going forward is the amendments to the federal rules which are supposed to go into effect at the end of this year, actually make proportionality a key factor in what is discoverable generally. So we move that language up to what can I discover? Well, it has to be proportional. And when you start talking about email archives, that's a really key factor. And so what we're looking at, we talk about the arguing for and against a burden. How do you make an argument that an email archive, which is what you use to keep your data and the day-to-day course of business, is too burdensome, or it's not proportional to get data out of that archive? And what are the downfalls of making those kind of arguments? Because the bottom line is, if it's your email archive and it's your data and it's unique instances of email, well, you're going to have to produce data from that archive. There really is no way around it. But the question is, where do people fall down when you're starting to make arguments about burden? And one of those things is lack of specificity, which is key. A lot of times what judges hear are lawyers whining, right? Oh, it's too hard, I can't get to the data, it takes a really long time. And judges hear that as just whining, complaining, and there's not a lot of specificity saying, well, I'm not making this up, it's not that it's hard, here's how much data there is, here's what it's going to cost. The other problem really is a lack of legal precedent. What does inaccessibility mean? What does it mean to say that there's an undue burden? And a lot of these things are very fact-specific. So you have judges, and discovery decisions often aren't made in a written opinion. So a lot of these arguments and the things that would support it, there's really not a lot of case law out there, and you're left to making less legal arguments and more practical arguments about what you can and cannot do from a realistic perspective. And you always need to keep in mind, of course, that if you're talking about a large litigation, if you're talking about a law enforcement investigation, the odds of you being able to produce nothing from your archives are virtually zero. But there are ways that you can control what's being requested, manage what's being requested, control the costs, that can make a big difference when you're talking about a burden or trying to limit the scope of discovery. So, how do you do it, right? That's the question. One is facts, facts, facts. Judges want to hear metrics. They want to hear numbers. They want to know that thought has been put into this and that it's just not a generic request saying this is too much. So I had a case, we were in front of a judge trying to get data out of a large email archive, and they wanted to do expedited discovery. And we were saying, look, the judge wants a 3-month schedule for production of data, and I'm saying I don't know that we can get the data out of the archives in 3 months, given the number of custodians and the volume of data. So what did we do? Sat in front of the judge. We had expert from the vendor give us a affidavit explaining why it takes so long to search these, what the timing is, that prioritizing isn't necessarily going to make it go faster. We explained the total volume of data in the archives, the number of servers that we had to search, what it would mean and what it would cost to get the data out of those archives. And, while the judge was sympathetic to some degree on the timing, we weren't given any relief from producing the data, but we did get some relief in terms of the timing and how long it would take. And we had to give reports every week on the details. This is how much data we have. This is how long it's taking to search. But it was the details, it was the metrics, it was the numbers that really made a difference in terms of getting the judge to listen and to understand and to realize that this wasn't a complaint, this wasn't lawyers making up, reasons to not want to do discovery. It was real, and we had specific information behind it to back up our timelines and the arguments that we were making.
Sorry, just a quick question. Like, what percentage of the matters that you're involved with are you dealing with archives?
I would say right now, the vast majority of them that we're dealing with archives, because so many companies have implemented these today, particularly because email has been such a concern in terms of deletion and getting rid of data and the inability to control it. And I think it's shocking almost how many companies have implemented these, but implemented them without real controls. They put them in place, push the button, and say, now I have an email archive and I don't need to worry about it. And what we're seeing in light of a lot of the issues that are happening now in terms of data breaches and data security, people saying, wait, now I have too much data. And this isn't just an eDiscovery issue, although my eDiscovery costs have gone through the roof because of the volume of data. But now it's also a security issue because I have vast amounts of confidential data sitting in my email archives. And I'm not sure how to get it out, and I'm not sure how to get rid of it in a realistic way. So more and more we're seeing a huge focus in this area.
Cool. Yeah. Sorry to break you from your stride, but I think a lot of the, as Michael had said earlier, and again, even myself with experience from sort of implementing those in the early days, everyone kind of deferred the tough decisions of retention and actually disposition at the end of these. And so, it's an area fraught with risk. So I'll sort of send you back over to your message.
Yeah, and I'll just to comment on that, because I think it's a key point now. People did ignore it for a while, but now, and it was sort of viewed as, well, storage is cheap, right? Storage is cheap and this is easy. But now this is really a corporate governance issue. This has gone beyond eDiscovery. It's gone beyond a fear of sanctions. This is a corporate governance issue at the highest levels, at the board level, saying, should we be keeping this data, and what are the risks to the organization of keeping information we don't need, and what does that mean when it comes to an email archive, and how do I get rid of it or move it to somewhere that's easier to access? And then making the burden argument continue, just talking about costs. Costs are key, particularly when you're talking about proportionality, because one of the main factors are how much is it going to cost you, how much is that cost in light of the resources of the organization, but also what's in controversy in the litigation. And so being able to provide details about how much it will cost, you probably have this information available to you. You've done litigations before, you've pulled data out of your archives, you know roughly how much emails is associated with one person when you're pulling your data. You know what it costs to search and to extract that data. You know what it costs to process that data. So you have that information. It's really extrapolating it to your current situation. But when judges hear, we've done this before, we know what the volumes are, we know what the costs are because we've seen what it costs in other litigations, and you can put hard numbers to it, they'll listen. They won't listen to, this is expensive. They will listen to, here's the hard numbers on how much this is going to cost me. And the other thing to think about is give alternatives. The reality is that who's ever on the other side, and frankly the court, they really are not in a position to tell you another way to do it or how you can do it better. They don't know. If you have suggestions, if you can put something out there that says, well, I can't do X, but I will search for this, and that's going to be more reasonable, it's going to get you what you need, it's going to make a big difference because the judges are looking for, they're not going to craft a solution on how to best search an archive, but they will listen to solutions, and if they sound reasonable, are going to give you the benefit of the doubt. You should and do know your archives better than the people on the other side. So if you can put together your alternatives, how you can search the data, how you can give the other side substantially what it is that they want, even if it's not everything, you've got a better shot of winning that argument because you seem like the reasonable one, and the other side is just throwing up their hands and saying, well, we don't like that, but I can't offer a realistic alternative. Just to touch on some case law to put some meat around this, and so you can kind of see what is out there. Thermal Design, the Guardian Building Products, this is a situation where, dealing with email archives, where an argument that there was just too big of a burden worked, and in part because the other side was being so unreasonable. So the request was, I want you to go search your entire email archive, not narrowing it by custodian. I just want you to go search all your email archives and all your shared network data for information for the case. That is, for anyone who has an email archive, virtually impossible, and would have taken a huge amount of money and a huge amount of time to complete, right? We did actually get a request like that once from the SEC who said, well, you have an email archive, and isn't it easy to just search the whole email archive because everything is there and available to you? And we had to walk through step by step. Well, let me explain to you what that means. And when you're searching billions of emails and all of these different servers and how long that would take, and by the way, you're going to get a lot of junk that we're going to have to process and the costs involved, they listened and they actually backed down, and we came up with a much more reasonable search request based on custodians and date ranges and the like to get them what they needed. But if you can make those arguments, it's going to make a big difference. And here, basically what the judge said is, look, the fact that defendants could do this isn't necessarily enough. This is a fishing expedition. The plaintiffs were not able to explain, this is why we need this data, we need this search and this data for this particular reason. They were making general statements about, well, but there must be data that's in there, and they can search it, so they should search it. And the judge said, no, the defendants have offered you an alternative. They've talked about custodians. They've talked about a more focused way of doing this. And your arguments are just general. And they're telling me it's going to cost $1.9 million when they've already produced to you a huge amount of data already. And it was, again, the defendants were able to make a successful argument because they put hard numbers to what they were talking about. They offered alternatives to the plaintiffs, and the plaintiffs were just saying, well, we want everything, and that's just not required. Discovery is not required to be perfect, and requests that are asking for everything because you can are not reasonable requests, and offering a reasonable alternative is going to get the judges to listen to you. Cost sharing is another thing to consider. Clean Harbors is a case where cost shifting was considered in the context of a backup tape restoration, again, an inaccessible data source. But again, one of the things that's interesting here is with the amendments to the federal rules that are coming up that I referenced earlier, in Rule 26, with respect to protective orders, they've added a reference to considering cost allocation in protective orders. And while that may not seem like a sea change, it is an acknowledgement that in eDiscovery, when we talk about the significant costs that are at issue, that cost allocation and cost shifting is something that should be considered. And when it comes to arguments about burden, cost shifting is a nice place to go to show that you're being reasonable. We're not going to try to keep the data from the other side. If they want this broad request, we'll do it. But we think there should be some cost shifting here. And in this case, there's a very detailed analysis of the Wigginton factors going through what factors should you consider and whether cost shifting is appropriate. And ultimately, what the court appreciated was that you had the party producing the data kept saying, we'll do it, but we want to split the costs. They gave proposals for how to split the cost. They explained what they would be doing, and the opposing parties kept saying, well, we'll consider that, we'll consider that. And so they didn't go to the court. There was no dispute. And at the end of the day, when they refused to split costs, the court took a look at that and said, look, I've got a party here who's been cooperating with you. They've offered alternatives. They've raised the issue with you of burden and talked about cost shifting, and you said you would consider it. You waited, in this case, it was almost a year before you said no. And now you're coming to me and saying you want them to do this and you want them to pay for it themselves. And I'm not going to penalize them for cooperating with you. I'm not going to penalize them for offering alternatives to how this data was going to be produced. Instead, I'm going to take a look at this and I'm going to actually split the cost, because if you want this data, you're going to have to pay for at least some of it. And so if you want to go to the next slide, these are just the Wigginton factors that talk about things that you should consider when you're talking about cost shifting. And these are pretty standard, right? How specific are the discovery requests? Is this a fishing expedition? Really important, how critical is the information? If the information is duplicative or it's cumulative, they don't need it. And it's one of the key factors that the courts will look at. And again, all of these things are pretty standard when you're talking about cost shifting. Is who has access to the data? How hard is it to get to the data? What's the benefits of producing this data versus what's already been produced? And of course, the costs and the resources of the parties. But think about cost shifting when you've got a request that's pretty significant. You know the costs are going to be broad. You've produced data already, or in this case, that what they're asking for is so broad, it's beyond what you would normally want to do. Throw cost shifting out there. Make the other side think about how badly they really want this data, and are they willing to risk being told they need to pay for it if they want that information. And I think ultimately, and this is the key point that everyone needs to remember, that's highlighted in the INRI plasma derivative protein therapies antitrust litigation, is that what is reasonable, perfection is not what is reasonable. Whether it's preservation or it's production, you are not required to be perfect. You are not required to produce all data that can exist in the organization, and that includes all data that's in your archive. So, you've got 10 custodians. There may be other custodians that have communications relevant to the litigation. Just because you can search it, do you have to? The answer to that is no. If the other side is getting the information that they need, that they've requested, and if your steps that you are taking are reasonable. I think that too often people get nervous and they don't want to have these fights. They don't want to make the burden argument because they think, look, this is my archive and I guess I should be able to get to it. And they don't think that there may be alternatives to what's being requested. But again, if you can make the reasonable argument and show that you're cooperating and getting the other side what they need, then you've got a good shot of winning these arguments and at least narrowing the scope of what you're doing. And you need to keep in mind that of exploring other alternatives to how to get the data. And when you have, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is do you work within the technology that you have? Are there alternatives to do it? How important is the case? And should you go a few steps beyond what you would normally do to try to get the data? But in the first instance, you've got to think about what is reasonable in light of the data that I have and what I can do, and is there a way to make the argument to limit the scope of what I'm required to do? So defeating the burden argument, so looking at this from the other side, one is, right, if you're trying to get the data and the other side is saying, look, this is too burdensome, I can't do it, challenge their estimates, make sure they're specific. If they're just saying generally this is going to be hard or it's probably going to cost me a lot of money, challenge those statements. Make them pinpoint how much it's going to cost. It may be burdensome, but it may not. And so the more you can make people try to be more detailed and really focus them on how hard is it, how costly is it, the better off your arguments are going to be. Of course, you can always bring in an expert who understands. If you're talking about an email archive and you don't understand the other side's email archive, you're not familiar with the technology, bring in an expert that says that we can do it better. It doesn't have to be that costly. There is another way to do it. One thing to always keep in mind if you're trying to defeat a burden argument is, why do you need the data? do you really need this information, and be able to make it specific. What is this a unique source of information? What is in that archive that you need, or what is in that they haven't produced already? The judges are going to be inclined to listen to a burden argument unless the data is critical to the case. But as we saw some of the earlier case law, general arguments that, well, I want it because they can get to it, are not going to get you very far. So think about, how do I make my argument specific to the data I need that's in this archive that they're telling me that they're not going to give me? And of course, point to retention or spoliation issues. So, if you're looking to get data out of the archives, what do you really need? What are you going to the archive for? What specifically is it that you want? And again, the more specific and detailed you can be, the more likely it is that the judge is going to order the other side to produce the data, even if there is a significant burden associated with it. And I think that, we're going to go to the next slide, this is one thing always to keep in mind, and this is for eDiscovery, it is for dealing with your archives in general, is what is reasonable today? And what is available to you today? So again, at one point in time, an argument that email generally was inaccessible might work. Today we know that would never fly. In any court, you'd be laughed out of court if you tried to make that argument. So you need to be aware of changes in technologies. And sometimes you say, well, how do I keep up with that? How do I know what's going on with technology? But at some point in time, you need to know, when does it stop being an undue burden? When can you do things that you might not have done before? Are there upgrades to the email archive that could be applied that's going to make your searching or your extraction faster? Are there new technologies that weren't available before but that are available today that you can use to get the data out of the archive? This is one of those things where you need to be prepared, because you might come up against somebody who does know email archives and who knows that there's technology out there that in a more reasonable fashion can get the data out of that archive. And part of always the issue with discovery is being prepared and having the information available when you're making your arguments. Because while discovery decisions generally may have an impact on costs and the timing of the litigation, they also have an impact on credibility. And if you have your lawyers in court who are making arguments about how burdensome something is, and the other side says, what are they talking about? There's this technology out there that they can use, and it's not that expensive, and it's reasonable in this case, and they're not telling you about that. It can damage your credibility in front of the court, and that can impact all sorts of decisions down the line. So you want to make sure that you're aware of not just the technology you have and how it works, but what alternatives there are out there, so that you're prepared to address, is that reasonable in this case? Is it not reasonable in this case? Have we done an upgrade? Why haven't we done an upgrade? Should we use this new technology or not? And you need to be prepared for that. We've been in front of Judge Shidlin a number of times, and many of you on the phone will cringe when you hear her name mentioned when it comes to eDiscovery, because not everyone's so happy with Judge Shidlin's decisions. But what she's said to us a number of times is, I can only rule on the information in front of me. And if the lawyers in front of me are not giving me all the information, then my decisions are based only on what they tell me, and they may not be complete. I don't know everything about your systems, and I don't know everything about possible technology that's out there. So I can only rule on what you tell me. So when you're going into these cases and you're making these arguments, you need to make sure your lawyers are prepared with detailed and specific information about your systems and how they work and the available technology, because that's the only way you're going to get the decision that you want. And when the judges hear you know about the technology, you're speaking intelligently, you can offer technological or other creative solutions to a problem, 9 times out of 10 they're going to listen to you, because they trust that you know what you're talking about and they know that you're prepared and you've considered the issues.
So Therese, on that note, I mean, obviously you've got a tremendous amount of experience in this space. I mean, but how do you stay current and basically stay abreast of sort of the technology evolution? Are you working with your counterparts in IT? I mean, obviously you're part of the broader industry, but for those that are basically sort of scratching their head and saying, what alternatives do I have? You've mentioned upgrades, other technologies. Are there good places where, like-minded attorneys can go to seek out these alternatives or alternative strategies?
Yeah, I think that one is working with your IT people and keeping in touch. This has become a much more cross-disciplinary area. This isn't just about the lawyers anymore. So one is talking to your IT people. They will often know what's happening. They may not have the ability to necessarily push through the upgrade, but they will know what alternatives are out there. Look, there's a lot of information out there. If you're somebody who's in the eDiscovery space, there are so many, whether they are webinars, whether they're conferences, these kind of issues are always being discussed. And you don't need to go to every one because there are many, many of them. But I do think keeping abreast of what's going on, listening, do the webinars, pay attention to the technologies. Everyone's always talking about what next new technology is out there. And the other thing I would say, and I think that people may be surprised about this, is listen to the vendors. It doesn't mean you need to engage every vendor or choose every technology, but listen to them when you have the opportunity. If they want to spend 10 minutes or 30 minutes talking to you, they're going to tell you what's out there. That helps to keep you up to date. It doesn't necessarily take a ton of your time. It can feel annoying at times when you're super busy, but they're the people who are on the cutting edge and looking for the next thing. And taking 10 minutes or 15 minutes to talk to somebody about what they're doing can give you insight into technologies out there that you may not be aware of that may impact eDiscovery.
Cool. Thanks, Reese. That was fantastic. I guess we'd like to sort of do a quick straw poll. This one's going to be a little bit different than the last one because basically the webinar doesn't allow us to sort of put a free-form text box up there. But basically, if you can, pump into the chat sort of your experiences, or you can post questions if you'd prefer them to be private. In your experiences, what technologies do you think currently bring undue burden on discovery? And I mean, this is a pretty broad strokes one. You don't have to name names, or you can name names, but sort of what are the aspects that you as a broader audience are having problems sort of around discovery? Is it cloud? Is it archive? Is it still backup tapes? Is it endpoint? Is it mobile? Is there anything that is particularly hot in your world that basically you're looking to be able to manage and sort of run into the problems of burden? I'll give everyone just sort of a moment or two to respond on that. So, I mean, as part of Nuix, I guess I'll sort of turn this over to Michael and maybe a little bit back to Therese. Within Therese, are you seeing things that are equally as hot as archives, mobile, cloud, any of that other stuff?
Social media still, particularly with new forms of messaging that people really don't know how to control, that's really hot. Mobile devices and how you manage data on mobile devices, also a huge area now, particularly with so many companies moving to BYOD. I think those are the two hottest and most challenging that we're seeing right now.
Gotcha. Yeah, curious. Basically, what you've just said has just been reiterated by a few of the participants. Mobile and social media, and the other one that came in was actually language translation. Mm-hmm. Any comment or thoughts on sort of dealing with this? I know from personal experience with you that you've dealt with email archives at a global scale. Mm-hmm. Any comments on sort of dealing with that amongst sort of the language issues that sort of might be associated with archiving and search at a global scale?
Language translation continues to be a huge issue, particularly now that so many litigations end up being global in scope and so many companies are global in scope. There's not a lot of great or perfect solutions. The technology, in terms of the technology to do translations now, is much better than it used to be. I mean, it used to be you had to hire somebody to spend a whole lot of money to manually translate documents and then certify the translation. That was extraordinarily expensive. There's a lot of technology that's out there now where you can run the documents through and at least get a preliminary translation, and then you sort of negotiate you produce the documents and then you negotiate official translations only of the documents somebody really wants to use. But it really does, particularly with the volumes of data, continues to be a real challenging area.
Cool. Thanks, Therese. I just want to sort of pull us back over to archiving and sort of turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, guys. That was great, Therese. So what I kind of got from what you were saying there, one of the things that permeated my brain was the idea that, old excuses don't necessarily work anymore, and therefore old technology doesn't either. And that can be a real dark cloud sort of looming over, well, the enterprises today. And speaking of dark clouds, let's talk a little bit about archiving challenges that we see. Just to bring some awareness to this stuff, a lot of you probably know it, but some of you might not, because some of these problems, they hide themselves in the archives. They lurk, in the shadows until they become a problem at the, often at the worst possible time. Archive servers will connect to these live email, file systems, and SharePoint servers, and they'll pull data out, as we discussed. And they do this over time. And it's one of those things that it just sort of works for a while, and you don't worry about it too much. But in the background, things might be happening that might not be desirable. One of those things that's very, very prominent that we see every single day, maybe 80% of the archive customers that we run into have index corruption. So those indexes that are made by the archive when the data is being ingested can serve them well until they become, well, let's say, fluctuating or sort of liquid. They don't stay the same, and they don't always maintain their level of integrity that they need in order to serve our eDiscovery needs. Furthermore, we see these back-end databases, which are frequently Microsoft SQL, not being designed to be big enough and have enough horsepower to support the ongoing burden of the archiving and the storage. Those SQL servers actually will maintain a lot of the rich metadata that the archive adds. They're not the indexes, they're just the part that keeps track of things like retention schedules and things that are on legal hold and that kind of stuff. So they are very, very important to the backbone of this. And I'm going to tell a story, a fairly gruesome story about that in just a couple minutes. As the data grows, the archives become just as unmanageable as those email systems were a year ago, or maybe 2 if you're lucky. You can't back that stuff up. It's too big to handle. We're consuming too much storage. So you kick the can down the road, and lo and behold, here it is again, and you're dealing with this. When the eDiscovery teams or the risk teams start to do searches using those bolt-on tools, what happens? Well, sometimes that poor old archive server can just become overwhelmed and just shut down and just quit on you. So then the whole thing comes to a grinding halt. The conveyor belt of data in and out stops, and then, well, we have a lot of problems. There's a few other things hiding that might be problematic. I talked about how nobody ever wanted to turn on the expiry capabilities in these archives, and that was prominent. And sometimes you can't go back. You can't go back to turn it on because then the poor old system can't delete it all because too much of it is eligible for deletion. Uh-oh, that leaves us in a bad situation. If you wanted to go back and classify the data according to its content, which you could do when you're first archiving it, oh boy, we just found out that's not retroactive. So as we start to make these good governance decisions that Therese was talking about making, oh, we can't. We're stuck. Oh no. And then another one that comes out that is always scary to attorneys is the fact that forensic integrity is almost never maintained in an archive. The data is pulled out, it's put into the archive, and when it comes back out, guess what? It's not the same. We have metadata being altered, and that scares a lot of people. And I can remember actually working with a very large firm, a law firm in Denver, that was having to defend a very famous corporate client that got in a lot of trouble, and their CEO went to jail. And they had a hard time dealing with the fact that the archives were part of a lot of the litigation, and the data did not have the integrity that was really required and really put them up against a wall. So these are just some of the challenges you need to be aware of. While you're sleeping, those indexes may become corrupt, and now your eDiscovery searches will be in flux and really cause you some issues.
So within that, how many people on sort of going to do a quick poll? So how many of you experienced the challenges doing discovery from massive archives? What type of problems are you aware of? So got some responses coming in. We'll give it probably another 30 seconds. But again, seemingly the most dominant ones are, actually, I don't know if people are multi-selecting, But basically, you've got a huge spread almost uniformly across everything. So let's go ahead and close it out, Nick. Yeah.
Wow.
So, Michael, you probably have a few comments on those.
Wow, beautiful. These are some of the things we're going to talk about. Some case studies here in our home stretch, guys, and they're going to talk about some of these things a little bit more. But yeah, this is revealing. I'm definitely taking a screenshot of this one. So moving on, guys, we're just about done here. A couple other issues you need to be aware of about these archives that might scare you if you actually encounter them. I've seen archives implemented improperly so that things like indexing isn't set properly. So in other words, we have a metadata-only index. So I can search things like to and from and subject lines and dates on an email. But I can't search content. Oops. Am I really going to re-index 24 terabytes, 50 million emails? Am I going to do that? So those implementation mistakes can really, really cause more horror stories. The data growth scalability issues. Okay, we're going to add more mailboxes. We acquired a company. We're going to journal more people. Oh, we're going to do SharePoint this year. Oh, we're going to do all the home shares. As we keep piling it on because we see the benefit, well, then we start to see all those back-end challenges start to happen where the poor old servers can't keep up. And then when eDiscovery hits those indexes, oh, now you've got the systems overwhelmed. We often sold, Steve and I think we both admit that we sold a whole lot of archives as set it and forget it. In other words, get them going and they'll run. And they will for a while, right? But the truth is they needed much more care and feeding than they were ever given. They need to look, the administrators need to look at the integrity of those indexes on a daily basis. You have to make sure they're not getting corrupt. You need to do the verification, that proactive management for these archives, because if you don't, well, all this bad stuff is going to come home to roost.
Yeah, like I was going to say, just to sort of second that, again, like the reality is most of these were implemented oftentimes under duress. In the early days, some people were buying for storage management, but then sort of oftentimes they were bought for compliance or other reasons, and they were really, they weren't bought to sort of realize business value. They were bought because they had to be bought, and so they looked to operate them as at a low cost point as possible. And so with that, many of these things, as Michael has referenced, and Therese, it comes back. I can personally speak to, as I'm sure Michael has, the number of archives over the years that he's had to go in and try to remediate, where basically large volumes of the indexes were corrupt, and for potentially years, searches that were run across those archives were returning incomplete sets of data. So that's talking about striking the hearts and fear into hearts and minds of attorneys when you sort of say, oh yeah, over the past 5 years of productions to external parties, we potentially have missed huge numbers of messages because the indexes just were corrupt, and in some cases, the system itself didn't actually notify you that it wasn't searching specific time frames for corrupt index.
Right. So you go and fix them, and then you get different results. That's what always happens. Like I submitted results that were wrong. I found out that I resubmitted different results, and so the question is man, when are you guys going to give us the truth here? This archive you have seems to be in flux pretty much constantly, and that's when you know you're in big trouble. So the crux of this whole thing, guys, is that eDiscovery bolt-on tools have to leverage something called an API. That's an application programming interface. This is a front door into that data, that complex proprietary data that can only really be governed by the archive itself. And in doing that, the problem is you have to leverage all of this stuff, all of this, this infrastructure, everything from the implementation mistakes all the way through the corrupt indexes and the overwhelmed databases. So now, what do you think is going to happen when you have that kind of a system supporting your eDiscovery? Well, you can't trust the search results. The searches go real slow. They don't complete. You don't know if you got everything. Production, so actually exporting things, takes forever. It was never designed for a pharmaceutical patent lawsuit where 8 million items have to come out of that archive upwards of 2 or 3 dozen times every year. We're not meeting the timeliness deadlines that Therese is talking about. It ain't happening. It's not going to work, right? So let's tell a couple of horror stories. Nick, go ahead and let's move through the last 3 here. These are some interesting real-life stories that Nuix was a part of. The first one to talk about is a very famous hospital system in the Midwest. Very large archives. This was an EMC, email extender archive. The customer eventually wanted to move to Office 365, but in the meantime, they had a real big burden around eDiscovery. 200 terabytes of emails, so that's 1.5-ish billion with a B emails that they had to try to mine for eDiscovery purposes. So I know when I was a deposition officer in California, my firm, we were able to serve over 250 subpoenas on medical facilities just in California every day. So the third-party subpoena thing is real big. Now, can you imagine on top of that having to place on the people in IT and in legal at this hospital the subpoenas that come in, the requests, the investigations that come in that are where they are actually defended, primary defendant in the case? Well, now you've got a serious eDiscovery burden, right? And as they were falling farther and farther behind, they realized that the archive was the source of the majority of their pain. So they would have this single eDiscovery server that ran a product called Discovery Manager that was trying its darndest to get data out of there in a simple search. And we're talking just a search for a particular custodian and or keywords. So nothing highly complex would take weeks and weeks. And now when a very large investigation comes in, now they were literally crippled. So they were really stuck. They followed all the rules and put everything in the archive, and it really, really let them down. Let's go to the next one, Nick. This is a very, very prominent company that everybody on this phone call has heard of. They had another kind of archive. It's called Axis One. One of the sort of more niche of the archives, not as large of a footprint as some of the others we've talked about, but still 40 terabytes managed to get into this particular archive, which was fairly large for them. They're doing a whole lot of not only patent but trademark type searches, as well as just your good old-fashioned human resources investigations. So a fairly large profile of different kinds of investigations that would include, as Teresa mentioned, that email archive. And what would happen to them, I remember meeting these paralegals in person, and they had those big circles under their eyes, and they were really tired and really frustrated, and they would tell me the horror stories of how they would like hop on one foot, cross their fingers, close one eye, and hope that the simple searches that they would initiate across this archive would actually complete. And sometimes they'd go 2, 3, 4 days with no monitoring, no feedback as to how these searches were progressing, and then all of a sudden they would time out or crash, and they'd have to report back to General Counsel, we're sorry, we're trying, it's not working, you're going to have to ask for an extension to the production date that we've already met and conferred about. So this was going on and on and on. And they were only doing, this kind of searches they were doing were so rudimentary. They would literally try like one custodian and one keyword. They had a list of 300 keywords. They'd do one keyword, and it wouldn't work. So obviously they were in a really, really bad place. Let's go to the next one, Nick. So this one actually covers two companies with the same crazy scenario. It's an Austrian agricultural company and in another hospital in the Bay Area in Northern California. Something happened that they really wished wouldn't have to their back-end database. So their archives had one of those SQL database. Enterprise Vault runs on SQL. And they accidentally deleted those very, very important, if not vital, SQL databases. And what happens then when they try to do their eDiscovery is the searches would return errors saying that none of the data was where it was supposed to be. So they couldn't even find it because the data map in SQL was lost. So these were fairly small-ish, 3 and 12 terabytes respectively of Semantic Enterprise Vault. Highly, highly compressed data. So even though those seem small, there were tens of millions of messages in these archives. So they panicked, of course, as you would expect, and they had to, come up with something else to do. So they had to figure out, we know that the data is still there. The data itself in these proprietary file types was still living on that archive file system where it had been growing over the years, right? And we know that even though the infrastructure was corrupt and not scalable, that there had to be a way, to get at this data. And that's where Nuix came in to help, right? So as Stephen said, we have, between he and I and a bunch of our other guys, both technical and non-technical, we have dozens and dozens of years dealing with these legacy archives. We've lived through, gosh, it's got to be 15 years. Stephen's probably at 17 years now of dealing with these email archives and all their complexity. And we're definitely here ready to help. So I'd love to have anybody on the phone who wants to talk more in depth about how we do this stuff, both technically and otherwise. I'd love to have that talk with anybody that we have today on the call. I think that's it for me.
Yeah, I think we want to bring it home and basically just thank everyone for their time and attention. And Therese, I want to specifically thank you for sort of joining our call today. I mean, you bring a tremendous amount of legal insight, but also sort of I know firsthand that you've rolled up your sleeves on the technology, and as Michael said, that some of the shadows that lurk around these email archives. So I know that you're speaking with authority on that. And to Michael for your sort of enthusiasm and knowledge around sort of archiving. But I think the one sort of takeaway that I would wrap up, sort of regardless of where you are in working with your archive on this phone, is Therese's advice around alternatives. Presenting alternatives to the judge, to opposing counsel, and actually not just presenting alternatives, but seeking alternatives. People have, knocked their head against the wall time and time again for years, trying to basically do the same thing over and over again. But basically encourage you to look to alternatives in market as well as sort of opportunities for new and different approaches. And so with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their time and attention. Specifically thank you, Therese. Specifically thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
All right. Take care, and everyone have a terrific day.